This is amazing. You guys are the fastest group to break out of coffee break. It's fantastic. Thank you very, very much, everybody. This way. Well, most people are here. Paul Groth. Please.
Hi, everybody. So this has been a really evocative, really interesting session I've had over this past couple of minutes or this past day. So what I wanted to talk about is something where I've been having a conversation with a colleague of mine, Anita Navarre, about the future of scholarly publication and whether we can get to a point where we can, in some sense, envision this world of applying this Ted Nelsonian notion of transclusion to scholarly publications. And the notion is, are we ready for that? And do we have the internet infrastructure in order to do that? And so that's what I want to talk about, and I want to get your kind of opinions upon this conversation so I can go back to my colleague and we can have a bit more of a debate internally. So there's been a lot of notion around this ability of what we call data-centric science or network science. So people talk about the Internet of Objects, so interacting and tracking the histories and integrating data from multiple sources. The notion of research objects from our friend Dave DeRoer, being able to, again, piece the parts of a scientific paper together from their different sources, whether it's the background literature or the methods or the logs or the workflows or the results. So this notion of network-enabled research has really been around for a while, and indeed you see the emergence of what I would call the modular paper in around 1998, and this is the idea that, in fact, just like in kind of hypertext studies, we can take the parts of the paper and assemble them together. In 2000, there was a whole discussion around argumentation networks for scholarly literature, again, building together networks of arguments. So representing the paper not as this linear form of text, but again, as networks. And then you have probably about 3 years ago, the rise of things like Jupyter Notebooks, where you have the inclusion of code and text together in one environment. And so what we've seen is this kind of changing the unit or the form of research. Now, I think this is kind of, personally, the kind of future of how we will do and create research communication. And so I have this debate with my colleague Anita, who instead emphasizes the real importance of persuasion. So she always likes to say that scientific articles are stories that persuade with data. And she almost compares them to fairy tales. And really her notion is that really the whole point of us writing a scientific article is to persuade. And we need all this persuasive verbiage in our texts in order to convince people. And so that really goes against this notion of modularity, the point of assembling papers together or assembling research communications together. So that's kind of the debate we've been having internally. Now I want to tell you a little bit about some infrastructure and some trends in scholarly communication that I think lends itself to this notion of a modular or integrated paper. So one trend is the autonomization of scholarly communications. So what we've seen is the emergence of smaller and smaller forms of articles. So you have something like Methods X, where the idea is you only publish the method itself, right? In a form of a scholarly article, but it's just about the method. Or you'll have something called a data paper. So it's just a paper describing a data set. Or a paper describing software. So here in this journal, it's called Software X. It's an abstract. It's a link to a GitHub repo with all the details about the software and a little bit more context. And these are a couple page long journal articles. So this is this autonomization of scholarly communications. And that goes even further. So people are starting to kind of do away with the text almost completely. So you have the publication of just straight up data, right? So this is just a data set that you put online, but you get the metadata that is directly associated. You get that DOI associated with this scientific article. You can get a DOI of your software. So the same kind of citation that we give for a journal article, you can now get for software and data. And let's get rid of the text altogether in publishing our scientific output. Furthering this, you can get even smaller. You can just have commentary. So you can really pick out pieces of comments using something like hypothesis. So this is an annotation on a paper that you can cite specifically. You can cite a review itself. So just the commentary in a review, and you can get a DOI for that as well. You can keep getting smaller. So we have, for example, a description in Elsevier of particular concepts themselves that you can actually specifically refer to. There's a notion of something called a nanopublication, which is one triplet statement where you can cite the actual subject-verb-object pairing together in data, right? So this is this trend of autonomization. Also in the scholarly landscape, we have this trend towards putting persistent identifiers on everything, putting DOIs on everything. So every paper we publish has a DOI. Every data set we publish has a DOI. We have persistent identifiers for funding and versioning. Oh, I'm missing bubbles. Oh well. We have IDs, persistent identifiers for scholars themselves, so ORCIDs. We have persistent identifiers for chemicals. We have persistent identifiers for physical samples. We have persistent identifiers for resources. So what we've done is create this web of persistent identifiers for scholarly objects. And all of those identifiers are actually backed by detailed machine-readable metadata. So another trend is a trend towards duplication in the scientific scientific literature. So what we're seeing is people publishing preprints on something like SSRN or archive, so they put up their paper, then they send that to a journal, it gets put up as a, before being reviewed, it gets reviewed, it gets commented on. And so you have this kind of ever-evolving notion of duplicating the same work over and over. And the question you might ask yourself is, why are you doing all this duplication, right, of your work? So my third, or my fourth trend here is this notion of machine writing. So machine reading is kind of a hot topic, so this ability for computers to do natural language processing and read text. But I think an interesting trend for us is actually having computers do the writing for us, right? So this is a really nice article called Towards Automating Data Narratives. And what they did was, what they did was they were able to actually take data set descriptions and generate different narratives depending on the audience involved. And so what we have is, I think, an existing infrastructure, an existing scholarly infrastructure that actually lets us do transclusion of documents. So you can take these persistence identifiers with metadata. From that metadata, actually use machines to generate narrative. We can use hypothesis and open annotation structures to quote in context. We can assemble that in a Jupyter notebook. And then from that Jupyter notebook, actually generate papers and presentations. So what we have is an alternative infrastructure, this DOI PID-based infrastructure that could let us do this notion of transclusion for a future of scholarly communications. So there you go.
Thank you. questions?
Yeah.
The notion of PIDs everywhere is attractive, but assumes that ground literals are recognizable and will stay ground literals into the future. Only 50, 70 years ago, for example, women were not scientists. And so we have to reconstruct the history of, say, astronomy, because people never cited work by women. How do you resist making exactly the same mistake again in your assignment of ground literals?
So usually the way, I can talk about technically how these persistent identifiers get made, right? So usually there's organizations that are minting these persistent identifiers. That's kind of one of the downsides of the scholarly infrastructure that's there through things like Crossref or DataCite. So these organizations building these PIDs. So you probably could end up in the same place. The difference is that you have some sort of social or institutional control versus what we have just with the web itself, where everybody can mint IDs. So that's kind of the difference. So it's probably, you could end up having the same problem, I guess. Yeah.
Could you just summarize a bit? Did you say in Drupal notebook or what? At the end you said, oh, if you put all these things together into what notebook? You said something new. What notebook you put these things
Oh,
together?
so there's this notion of something called a Jupyter notebook, is where you can write Jupyter notebook.
Okay, I don't know that.
So it's a very popular format for doing the combination of code and text
Okay.
and data in the same open file
Yeah,
format.
so Jupyter.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Les, I'm sure you have a question.
When can I have it? I mean, I'm really interested in the issue of why we don't see. It's fantastic that you're doing this, and I don't wish to sound like I'm sort of separating you out from anything else. But why are we seeing more innovation in these areas in the academic sphere? Why don't academics have private industry and all sorts, sort of doing a lot more? So we're seeing lots of experimentation and then services created. But sort of I come from a time when there was software created and then we'd all share it around the internet. Everyone would have a go. Am I just not looking in the right places? But I think what you're doing is absolutely amazing, and please let's have some more of it.
No, I mean, I think you need to look for it. Also, I guess the question is, what do you qualify as innovation, right? So I think in the last probably 3 years, the emergence of people putting up data sets and being able to cite data has been a dramatic change in the way people do scholarship, right? And I count that as an innovation. So just that's one example. Or for example, the rollout of the notion that it's important to cite data as equivalent to citing papers, and the fact that most major journal publishers now have support for data citation, right? So I think that's a big step. Or this emergence of smaller kind of micro articles around different artifacts. So I think all those are innovations per se. I think the amazing emergence of if you go look at the environment around something like NumFocus or Matplotlib or Jupyter Notebooks is pretty amazing how fast that's gone in terms of people producing and putting kind of these interactive pieces of scholarship where you have the combination of code and text and data all in one. So I qualify all those as innovation. I think the place where people are frustrated is on the social factors, where those kinds of outputs are not seen as equivalent to what would be traditional academic outputs. So I see a lot of social frustrations, but I see a lot of cool technical developments, and I think that's sometimes the hard part.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Christopher Gutteridge.
Hi everyone. So I was trying to go big picture on this. I'm not a researcher. It turns out I tried to do a degree once in scholarly communication, PhD, sorry, and it turns out I hate reading and writing research papers, which really was a problem. But it inspired me a lot to tell you what's wrong with them. Okay, so my background's open data, open access, open source software. I begin to get a theme. I was trying to find something on the line to show that information's complicated, and the slide's not quite showing up there, but that's a deck of playing cards. That's from analysing an RDF dataset. And I was thinking, this whole thing, what is text? Text is a bunch of symbols in a row, mostly. It's putting some ideas into orders. And I was thinking, why do we bother? Beyond the actual grammar and sentence structure, why do we actually put things into order at all? Why don't we just do it in RDF? Why don't we just humans do RDF instead? Wouldn't that be easier? And I've had a lot of lunches with Freud lately, and it's been his sounding board, so some of this may sound familiar. But one of the obvious things is that humans experience things in a linear way. Even if I happen to read through the phone book, cutting to find a thing, my experience of time is in a straight line. Even if I'm playing a computer game where I can make choices, I'm having an experience in a straight line. And as been discussed, books are random access scrolls. I love that. But books are by their very nature in a straight line, and that's what most of our things have been written for in the past. And even books which are non-linear in themselves, the books where you have to find specific sections in are ordered because you need to find something in them. So thinking of some good reasons other than the media to put stuff in order. Why do we bother at all? And one is, the huge one, is to orchestrate a response, an emotional response. I've been trying to find something about spoilers without actually spoiling anything. So this indicates to me some kind of emotional response due to things happening in order. If they happened in a different order, you wouldn't react in the same way. But there's other things that still orchestrate a responsiveness. They're effectively a form of entertainment. And most sharing, even between academics, it's persuasion, as we said. It's not just stating the facts as is. We are still telling a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and end. If I read a 5-page article in New Scientist, it's actually, if someone told me what the punchline was, it's still not as enjoyable as reading the crafted story. But it's only narrative for entertainment which really has spoilers. I was trying to, this is my other picture I found to illustrate spoilers without actually spoiling anything you may not have seen yet.
What does it say?
Yes, I'm a butler and I am the killer. Right, so other good reasons for putting stuff in order. The obvious one is to help people understand it. You put the ideas in an order so that you can start people with the ideas they need to understand later ideas, and you're crafting a route through it. I don't actually have this book, but maybe I should. Right, so a sequence of steps. This is actually a terrible recipe for a cup of tea I found on a children's website. It's actually skipping wait for the bottle it to boil, but and to enable non-linear access, as we talked about, the books that actually enable you to find information in a non-linear way in linear information, but we also do it to fill out a template, either for a good reason or just because it's required of us. And this should be a fairly familiar one. We've already seen, there are variations on this, but this is still basically what most research communication is squeezed into. And I was thinking, the whole point of academic it might be persuasion, but it's not entertainment. It shouldn't matter if someone tells you the punchline of what a paper's about. In fact, you want the spoiler for the paper. In fact, that's the abstract. In fact, it's the last line of the abstract usually. The abstract's quite long, skip to the end. What did they actually do? It's inconclusive. And I think this isn't quite true. I was thinking maybe formal. Formal academic communication is not entertainment. Am I still... I've been listening today and rewriting these slides again and again. So... the academic record is not entertainment, but I'm not sure research papers and the academic record are quite the same thing. And I'm starting to wonder whether or not the academic record is more like a blockchain, that this is a bunch of things that we need a recording of, and that's not the same thing as us talking to each other. Right, so this is another classic academic piece of text. I have got a series of symbols that I, with a bit of experience, know. I know that represents the people who contributed to this work. I don't know what C. Gutteridge's first name is. Why the hell do I not have my full name on that? That's my paper. No one knows I'm called Christopher from that text. That's really annoying. I also know that it's part of a journal volume, which is part of that actual journal, and I know that that is in volumes, and that is paginated, and it has these dimensions of relationships. I also know that it must have been published, because it has a published date, and that means it was probably accepted, and I guess it was probably submitted and must have been completed at some point, but I don't know for sure it was completed before it was accepted. Maybe there was a second version. It's lost. And we're crowbarring normal research into these structures with the variations we've just seen. Your talk would be much better after mine, so you could answer my questions. I think about it, and putting things into order is a form of destruction as well as creation. You're actually deciding what not to tell people. I've deleted a lot of slides, I've deleted a lot of things. Some of what I deleted was because it wasn't helpful to the argument or wasn't convincing or it's a bad flow. Some of it just there wasn't time for. I had a whole different analogy. And I'm thinking about coding. I'm a coder, so coding is not like authoring. Coding is like writing text, short text. Whereas you take an instruction, you turn it into a sequence of statements. It's like a paragraph. Whereas authoring is a much more complicated thing, and programming is not the same as authoring, but it is the same level of complexity. We're taking non-structured information and trying to structure it in a way that benefits both the writer and the reader, and in this case the computer. And we've got all these tools. This is a tool for children to program in, that you can see the shapes of the things. We don't have this in writing. This is a paper from 2017. This is a paper from when the year I was born. They haven't changed. So, right, I'm going to get to the end. And this is the bit to a life road.
You do have 3 minutes.
Oh, I thought you said 1 minute.
No.
That was a 3-minute slide. Oh, you're waving that slide. Oh, God. Okay, well, I'll stop rushing then. Okay, coding. I thought I was going. Coding is grammar and syntax. Programming is more like authoring a novel. But no one tells us how to new structures of novel. Maybe Elsevier are beginning to. And we need to be designing how we communicate and how we allow communication. Blah, 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 CC by. Okay, so linear communication is good. There are reasons for it. You're helping people. It's a courtesy. But it should be a signpost through information, not barbed wire forcing people through information. This bit to a knife road, that tools aren't the solution. By his app. But tools are not the only solution, and we need to create the environment. This has not got the right environment to function as a tool. And so we do need to create the academic environment. With ePrints, we created an expectation that open access could happen. And once people have seen a paper available online, then they start to ask for it, and it changes the environment. And we need to create this environment. And I think we also need to ask, is the academic record of what people have researched the same as the way we communicate it with humans? Whew. That's fine, I'm done.
So I just wanted to bounce off a couple of ideas of you based on what you were saying there.
We have a whole minute spare.
Text is inherently linear and sequencing is destruction. What that makes me think of immediately is sculptural hypertext. So that raise a couple of eyebrows as you're reading through. Yeah, sculptural hypertext is this idea that rather than having the links in there formally, everything is linked to everything, and as the reader reads, they destroy some of the links, so eventually you take something that is non-linear and make it linear. And in looking at that, something I've sometimes thought of is actually are all texts like that? That even though you might think they're presented linear, people are reading parts of texts that they're choosing to read, right? They're not actually constrained to go from page to page to page. Is it perhaps better to say, someone's experience of a text may be linear, but all texts themselves aren't necessarily linear by their own function?
If read by one person, if multiple people are reading them, they're being non-linear because there's multiple viewpoints at once.
Sure.
But
I have a question. What are the main points of your talk? So you can summarize for those who is now allowed to return from meetings.
what are the main points of my talk?
What you want to use him as an example, as a case study, what you want Vint to take from your talk?
That's pretty good. I'll put up a last slide that summarised my main points. We don't need to just need tools, we need to change expectations so that we create consumers demanding the tools, and then they'll pay for them. And people aren't paying for liquid, and people don't know that they're wrong yet. And we need to create consumers who know they need these things, and that's hard. There's the chicken and egg problem. No one wanted RSS until LiveJournal started doing RSS and people started building tools for RSS.
I would argue that a lot of academics have a lot of things that they think are wrong without academic writing, but we are forced into certain structures by a factor of our jobs and lines of work, right?
Well, sort it out, you're the academics!
Can you do
But you're
your
not
sample?
required to produce crap, and that's what an awful lot of academics are
Yeah,
doing,
just
because
do
the
those two.
metric is how many
Summation.
Fix that.
I've just requested that
I'm just being asked to reprise.
just 2 slides to highlight because I think they're really important.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bent, I know you had important business with academic people.
So, yeah, the point there being that people give roots through information that's really valuable and that is an important part of human communication, and we shouldn't be trying to stop it. We should just be stopping people putting up barbed wire and encouraging people to put signposts through information instead. And this was the one to annoy Freud, to tell him that tools aren't useful if you don't create the correct environment for them to work in. And a tool by itself, without the environment that it's going to work in, isn't enough. You've got a lot.
So just one mathematical observation. If you're going to design text which is deliberately not linear, if it's a sort of a hypertext environment, then we're going to have to figure out how do we help the reader do a Hamiltonian through the text to make sure that you got all of it. Yes.
And that's one for Telltale Games again. That's how do you get the most value out of a computer game when you made the wrong choices and didn't see half the cool video?
Yeah, yes, you need a physical piece.
I don't know.
Yeah, futures.
Does the existence of irony or polyphonic music shake your conviction at all that text is linear?
I can't read 2 pieces of text at the same time. Maybe some people can.
But I think it's really important. Chris is highlighting it's a linear experience for the reader. Even if you jump around, for him, in his timeline, it's linear, which is kind of interestingly different.
Assuming that the text is linear.
Dave? No, my time is still linear. Dave?
So we've talked a lot about the academic paper. You mentioned the academic record. And what's interesting about the academic record as a whole is that many of the properties that we find interesting. So we have papers that are covered with other papers, and papers which are tours or trails through the academic record. We have revisions and annotations and updates. So is the problem here a problem of scale and speed, rather than a problem of complexity and structure?
That's left to the academics to solve. Someone I don't know.
We do cause an awful lot of problems.
Academics, the cause of and solution to all our problems, like Tommy Simpson said about beer.
I texted linear possibly, but I don't think thought is cognition. Paul Smart's sort of talked about text as angry, words angry things. How would you represent Sherlock Holmes' mind palace?
I'm not a fictional character. I think about one thing at a time. I can have maybe a very short stack, but I don't know how the rest of you think. I can only speak for myself.
Hang on, you're not allowed to go yet. I think it's really important to highlight that the different kinds of linearities we're talking about. All right? There's the experience linearity, and then there's the authoring linearity, and then there are how you mix it up. Properly, you cannot focus on more than one thing at the same time anyway, right?
Okay.
I think there's it's worth reading Joyce's Ulysses, because what you realise there is that as you read, you can read the text and you don't understand anything at first. Then you read the context and you start understanding it. So you start realising that as you read the context, you start understanding it. And the more you read the context, the whole novel transforms itself.
I've read the Robert Anton Wilson summary of it, and that was
You have 15 seconds.
Even better than reading Ulysses, try reading legislation book.
Thank you, Chris.
I just used the idea.
Thank you. Right. Yep. Can you do me the honour of saying your name? Because it's such an amazing, and I don't want to mess it up.
My name is Zyxmn,
I'm pretty sure my dad was pretty drunk when he named me.
Playing Scrabble.
Pretty much lost. So a bit of my background. So I graduated in microelectronics in University of Southampton, and I did a bit of electronics for a while. And recently I moved to software, and now I'm a developer at Sparrho. So Sparrho is basically an online platform used in 2,000 institutes over 150 countries. So users can find research that matters to them. It's pretty similar to Elsevier. So before starting off, I'd like to thank Frode for giving me this opportunity to present here. So in today's age, there is an overload of information, and technical novel and complex text is no exception to that. So therefore, there is a need for technology to help us effectively track information that's relevant to us. So for today, I'm going to speak what we think at Sparrho are the three main aspects or pillars of research text. And they are primarily, this is what I want you to take from this presentation, accessibility of the text, how easily it is discoverable, and most of all, how is it reliable. So effective dissemination of scientific research is crucial for human progress. So research texts such as patents and papers and conference proceedings are primarily the way right now researchers communicate their findings. And according to the Scientific, Technical and Medical Publisher in 2015, there are over 2.5 million research papers published every year, and that volume is expected to double every 8 to 9 years. So starting off with accessibility, what do I exactly mean by accessibility? So in the world of research, accessibility primarily means reading the full content. So why is this important? So even a recent example is when we had coffee, the coffee break recently, Miss Claire just pointed out that there's this genius kid who discovered a way to detect pancreatic cancer, but was complaining that he did not have enough pocket money to access research that he wanted to study, basically. So one of the cases. As more and more funders and institutes support open access, there is a decreasing portion of latest content that's behind paywalls, but that alone is not enough. Just accessibility on its own, it is good, but it's just not good enough. Why is this? For example, take the Stockholm Public Library, which is actually the background of this slide. Once you get in, you have access to over 2 million books. And without the appropriate tools, it's going to be extremely time-consuming to find relevant material and work out whether it's up to date. So as mentioned before, the output of research content is only going to increase. And it's not enough to have text to be merely accessible. So that's why it has to be also discoverable. So with these millions of scientific research papers published up to date, how does a researcher go about finding information that's relevant to them? So search engines and scientific database have solved part of the problem. You put in certain filters, you put in, and you're able to whittle down the papers that you scan and find the relevant information you need. So at Sparrho, we basically try to make that discoverability factor a bit easier. So, for example, if when you have research text that uses very highly specific terminology, and in a very narrow context, it is difficult for researchers in even adjacent fields to actually understand the full implications of these new findings and have cross-collaboration, even by serendipity. So we believe that, so how do we actually improve this? So we believe that the key factor for discoverability is actually simplicity of the language. So if you go to the Sparrho platform, you have access to over 60 million research papers that are updated daily from over 45,000 journals across all fields of science. So if you do any single research, still you're going to get a daunting number of results. So that's why to stress on our belief of the simplifying language to aid discoverability, we introduced the concept of pinboards onto the platform. So what is the idea being that a researcher can curate and summarize
their area of interest. So you have the heading for their topic, the curator's name, and also a pinboard summary briefly explaining what their area of research is. We stress that this has to be very simple and concise. And also the papers that they use to actually generate this pinboard. So what does this pinboard actually give? It is actually a portal for readers to get initiated to a new field of science. So since it uses simple language, it also helps users to understand a new area of research. The summary of the pinboard is created by the curator, but it is in Sparrho's roadmap to actually have the AI generate an automated summary which can be given to the curator to be revised, improved. So that's one part of us helping discoverability, that is trying to simplify the language by the introduction of pinboards. So our second part is our recommendation engine, so which uses text analysis and natural language processing. So here's a simple visualization. Oh, sorry, wrong keyboard. So here's a simple visualization created by one of our interns as to how we draw connections between a single paper in a pool of, say, 70,000 papers. So Sparrho's system takes various factors into account, and the degree of connectivity between a single paper and the rest of the papers in the pool is based on just plain text similarities, not just words, but also the linguistic structure, the user's input, and the author similarities, and also, interestingly, the network built by the Sparrho users. For example, when you take the pinboards, how are these papers actually used? Does the user pin two papers, and how are they interlinked? So we use this information to create tailor-made recommendations for other users. So it is still a work in progress, but we are still working to make science more discoverable and reliable. So one of the challenges of having so much information at our fingertips is that whoever shouts loudest gets believed. So for example, the anti-vaccination movement, so which gained traction from a paper that was published in 1998 on The Lancet. It has been discredited since, but still, the movement still persists. So we take reliability quite seriously at Sparrho, and we are still exploring ideas as to what makes the content that we have at Sparrho to be reliable. We were thinking of using hand-selected experts to review the content, which is similar to the model that universities have, or what the model that exists right now, or assist the person who's actually creating the content, their track history in creating projects and data sets and content they might have authored, and also public talks they might have given. What really interests us is how do we actually determine reliability at scale and without bias. But right now at Sparrho, our primary focus is on enhancing discoverability, so to ensure that people get the credit that they deserve. Again, wrong keyboard. It's very confusing. So we know that making the latest scientific research discoverable is extremely difficult and cannot be achieved by Sparrho's efforts alone. So we are always keen on working with other organizations who align with our mission. And so any ideas or suggestions in increasing our discoverability or reliability of the content available is always welcomed. Thank you. And also, just a cheeky slide, we are hiring as well, if you know anyone who's interested.
Fantastic. Thank you. Questions? You get
Yes.
I'm
I'm a keen observer of these kind of interventions in the scholarly college ecosystem. I like your final assessment. Reliable is a good one. I haven't seen that so much before. I wonder if you can comment on how this compares to some other combinations of words or axes like that. So the FAIR principles are findable, accessible, but then interestingly interoperable and reusable. And you touched on interoperable through the discoverability. The interesting thing about interoperable and reusable is that they mean as people reuse things, if they add new content that interoperates, or just through usage adding value, then the ecosystem is adding value to those things that are being published. So I wonder if there's another principle in your, if it fits in your three, or whether there's a fourth that is this kind of usage adds value and whole you get network effects.
Yeah, definitely. So as we get more and more users, we collect more and more data as to how they behave, and so it helps us actually refine our search methods, which directly affects the Sparrho recommendation engine. So it makes we can provide a final result. So the more users we have, and the more behavior we actually can gather, the more information we gather, the better the results here.
Just a quick clarification one. Are you, the little snippets, pinboards you're doing, that's done by a curator? So somebody's
Yes, that's the user. And one of the challenges right now is to actually, anybody can create a pinboard. So how to actually validate that the pinboard is of substance. So that comes into reliability again. So that's one of the challenges we face.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was very interesting, and it's certainly very interesting to see how you enable the user to curate and link sort of different documents. But now, what I'm wondering about is that the research on the current academic, say, social networks, indicates that academics are quite reluctant to use it to collaborate and cooperate. So there's very low percentage of people using, say, shared folders on Mendeley or question boards on ResearchGate. So I'm wondering how do you see Sparrho differing from those like other services and convincing researchers to use these boards?
There's a private button feature. You press that, all your research is hidden. So your pinboard is hidden, but your public profile will still be available. But if you look at the profile page, it would just be what you do, or if you fill it up, and the pinboard section or any content that you created or any research that you've done, it's all hidden from public domain.
If it's private, then you still use it for your algorithms to see the links.
Yeah, we use it, but it's not linked to.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Look, Moreau.
Thank you. So, who knows about the blue whale challenge? Who's heard about that? No? It's a game. Participants, typically fairly young, are assigned a mentor, or mentor in quotes. The game lasts for 50 days, involves self-harm, and on the 50th day, the order is to commit suicide. And I got to learn about that when the head teacher of my boy, who was 10 years old, called us, telling us that my boy was talking about this at school. So it's memes, it's hoax maybe, but also it's real life. Okay. On that day I checked parental control, it was fine. But it's a story that is scary. So I looked at it at the time, back in May, trying to understand where it was coming from. And apparently that comes from Russia. And of course. And you try to find any evidence, and there is nothing. You really can't point to something. Thinking about this presentation, I looked at it again more recently, 2 weeks ago. And you continue to see articles in the press on a very regular basis. And you try to find evidence, again, nothing. Okay? So to me, provenance is something that could be really useful in that context. Can we find the provenance of those memes or those stories or those texts And having something that is a bit automatic would be really useful in this context. So, provenance, 10, 15 years ago, people were talking about it in the context of food or in the context of art, okay? For art is that gives authenticity to a piece of art. For food, it's typically a sign of quality. Now, look at this quote from 2010 from Jeff Jarvis. Good curation demands good provenance. Provenance is no longer merely the nicety of artists, academics, and winemakers. It is an ethic we expect. And it's true that over the last 5-10 years, you've seen something very different. There are lots of contexts in which provenance is mentioned. To me, it's starting on the right-hand side in the context of e-science. How do you reproduce scientific results? We talked about that earlier. Open data and open data journalism also look at provenance. The business, in terms of making their supply chain transparent and being more accountable, also talk about provenance. I'd like to give you a good example of provenance. If I had known that John would have been here today, I would have chosen the example from the Gazette. Sorry, John, it's a competitor. But it's the National Climate Assessment, a report produced every 4 years by the US government. The last one was produced in 2014, and I hope that there will be another of those reports in the future. They decided in 2014 to make this report provenance enabled. It means that when you navigate that document online, you will come across pages like this one showing precipitation change over the US, and then you can read the narrative. This image there is derived from a data set, and you can follow the link. And a process was applied in order to generate that data set. Again, you can follow the link and find instruction about it, information about it. Underpinning this narrative is a data model, RDF here in this case, and you can see that the URI to this image was derived from a URI to that data set. The term was derived from is one of the terms that we standardize at the W3C, at the World Wide Web Consortium in the Provenance Working Group. That's the definition of provenance as we defined it in the working group. So provenance is a record. It contains a description of the people, the organizations, the entities, the activities that have influenced a piece of data or something in general. Could be a book, as we were talking about it earlier. So coming back to the problem of fake news, what is the problem? So first, fake news is not new. It has been around a long time ago. What is different this time over the web is that you've got a number of characteristics coming together. There is a lot of automation, lots of bots involved. We've got viral propagation on social networks, very little editorial control over what is being published. It goes across organizations, and sometimes even you've got laundering of news. You've got something that is published on a social network, and then a respectable newspaper, in quote, is going to publish an article about that social network news, and then suddenly it's becoming official and published on their website. And overall, a total lack of transparency. And from my point of view, having worked trying to standardize provenance, why can't we see the provenance of those texts on the web? So I'm not going to give you a presentation about the standard prof that we defined, but we spent 2 years. Paul was my other co-chair in the working group. We spent 2 years producing this specification prof. And I thought I would be the first to show some prof, but no, we did it earlier. But really, prof is a vocabulary that allows you to describe the provenance of things. So you've got the notion of entity, for instance, a piece of text. some activities like writing a piece of text or editing a piece of text, and then you've got agents, people, services, organizations involved in these processes. And then you've got relations between those different classes. So when you talk about web resources, you can describe some minimal provenance for it. You can say, we've got this resource on the web, there is some agent associated with that resource, and that resource refers to other resources by means of links over the web. So what I did was to write a little script that would go over, in fact, would crawl the web from a few of those articles about the Blue Whale Challenge, would create some provenance out of the data I was finding in those web pages, and then I wanted to see what the provenance looked like. Well, I couldn't find a tool that could visualize the provenance that I was generating. I had about 1,500 documents, and I simply couldn't visualize it. I didn't have a tool good enough. What is interesting is to apply some of the techniques that we've developed as researchers over those provenance representations. And what you see here is the simplest summary that I could generate out of those 1,500 resources. And it says that you've got resources that talk about the Blue Whale Challenge. They refer to other resources that are not about the Blue Whale Challenge. And then there's a set of other resources that I've not processed because I limited my search over 1,500 documents. And then that summarization technique, you can refine it and configure it in different ways. And a second summarization is here, which is starting to present some insights. And I just spent a couple of hours on this, so I don't have a final result. But we can see that we've got articles referring to themselves, or articles of an organization referring to the same organization. So we've got kind of echo chambers in this kind of phenomenon. So I think that we've got a very powerful tool to understand what's happening in those kind of networks. So fake news are important, okay? We know the kind of potential very negative effect they can have, let's say, over elections. I think the corporate world does not always have the incentive to tackle the problem fully, and in part because it's not something that is within a single organization, it's cross-organizational. And I think we need solutions that are auditable, that allows us to understand those connections between documents and the measures of trustworthiness that are being developed. And for this, provenance for me is critical. And what is really promising is the analytics techniques that here and with others we've been developing. Question?
He's not my boss anymore, he's my former boss, so don't go easy on him.
So 5 guys in a basement decide they want to embarrass Zoe Quinn and chase her out of her industry, and do this by any means necessary. Or 5 guys in St. Petersburg do the same, except they want to elect Donald Trump. That's the source, but you'll never find the provenance.
The fact that there is a provenance is already an indication that not necessarily you should trust it. I think that once we understand, once there is a agreed way of collecting provenance, we can have tools telling us there is no provenance about this, don't trust it. Okay, or have some form of rating that is related to the fact that there is no provenance associated with some resources. So in fact, if you start making this explicit, there is some form of social incentive for people to publish the provenance of their resources. Now you're going to say your guys in St. Petersburg may create false provenance, and of course there are ways of dealing with that. Some of it also part of the same model.
Just as kind of a comment on that, it took me a long time to wrap my head around your work with provenance. What really brought it to my attention, the importance of what you're doing, I read an article during the election. It was clearly absolutely horrific, but there were lots of links. So it looked like it had citations, but you clicked on any of those and it said, this is bullshit, this is a spoof.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that clicking on a link even takes energy. So people don't check the citation. So that's why to take the provenance front and center is so important.
Mm-hmm. And there are websites doing kind of journalistic analysis or forensic analysis even of some claims, okay? Some in the US, some in the UK, everywhere. And these can be part of the same setup, okay? So you could have not only information about the provenance of resources, but also ratings produced by various organizations, and all that, I think, could be processed automatically and give us some help. Because when I see this thing about the Blue Whale Challenge, at the moment, I still don't know whether that's true or not.
So, I'm sorry, I just about to take a call. Two things come to mind. The first one is that there's an infinite recursion problem hiding in here. Perhaps you've already encountered it. How do I assure the integrity of the references and what their whole trail of references? And so, digital signatures and things like that, although they are attractive, sometimes still don't necessarily do the job. Anyone who's had a certificate faked on them from a certificate authority knows what I'm talking about. But there's a second observation about provenance, which I was quite surprised to learn. In the early history of the Church, the Catholic Church, there were a number of documents written under the names of what we would have called the apostles. And the only reason that those names were attached to those documents was to give the document credibility.
Mm-hmm.
They were completely fake.
Yeah.
And in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that it was known, some of them managed to make it into the canon anyway, because I guess somebody said, well, I don't care if it's not true, it's a good story, so that's included. I hope I haven't insulted anybody, but the point I want to make is that the idea of trying to establish provenance has not, this problem has been with us for a long time. Yeah. Technology might help, but it is not the absolute solution, and I'm pretty sure you didn't say that either while I was out of the room.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. So first, I don't believe there is necessarily one version of the provenance of something. The way we designed the prov model is that we support multiple provenance of provenance. Okay, ultimately these are assertions that someone made, and those assertions have themselves provenance. Okay, and we don't have, I believe, the tools, the techniques, the logics in order to reason about those multiple versions of provenance, but I think we have to start somewhere. I don't think we're making use of the technologies that we have at the moment. I'm not claiming that they are sufficient to solve the problem, but it's a start, and more work is required.
We are in complete agreement.
Yeah. Last question. Thank you very much. Just looking for your name slide, Wendy.
But we all know who Wendy is.
Professor Dame Wendy Hall to close out today.
Yay. Well, Fred said I didn't need to do slides, so I haven't. Lots of wonderful slides today. Fred also said I should summarise. So I've been here, but I apologise to the 2 or 3 people whose talks I missed. And I was going to say no one mentioned Vannevar Bush, and of course Mark did. Well done, Mark. So I'm going to sort of weave 10 minutes around how I got into this world, where I think it's going, and what people have said today. It's been an amazing set of talks, and I want to, before I forget, I want to thank Frode and Edgar for, and Emily, of course.
You mentioned Edgar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Still, yeah. Anyway, so thanks to Frode and Edgar for organising this day. Let's start off with that, shall we? We may say more later, and there's tomorrow. But I know you want to do something at the end as well, so.
Just 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, so well, I started with Bush because that was where to me this all started. That paper of As We May Think, and I'm going to come back to that at the end as to what the future of text is. Also, as I think it was Frode said, Ted was right. And the more I continue to work in this field, I know he was right. He's just released, he was 80 in June. He has the biggest chip on, we're recording, aren't we? Better be careful. He's just released his, as a YouTube of him talking about why he should have been famous, more famous, all the things he's invented and that people have ignored, that we still don't do right. And I'll try and remember to send the link around to everyone. It's very TED, it's quite a concise, it's about 50 minutes, which for Ted is quite concise. But you know, of the things that it was Vannevar Bush, Ted and Douglas Engelbart that inspired me to get into hypermedia. I better speed up a bit. But Ted was right, things like, but really it was non-linear text was what that's what I used to teach about. Hypertext and non-linear text. He got hypermedia back in the 60s, right? Amazing. Two-way links, he was right about that, Tim. I'm sorry, Ted was right. Micropayments, he was right about that. Transclusions, which I am a great fan of, and I think that was one of his most profound inventions that we don't use enough of. And I often ask people, is that a transclusion? They go, yeah, no, I don't know. Actually, very profound that I think we should use more of. Of course, he wanted everything to go through his system. It was very proprietary. But in terms of what we needed for this new world, he knew about. His Xanadu design inspired the design of the dynamic generic links we had in Microcosm, again, also As We May Think. And of course, then along comes Tim with the World Wide Web, embedded one-way links, and we've been retrofitting hypertext to the web ever since, which seems the most ridiculous thing to say, but it's true. It was a very, very basic form of hypertext in the web. And we've been retrofitting security to the web as well, and other things. And Tim would be the first to admit the security bit. I'm not sure he'd agree about the hypertext bit. And today, it's all about, I hate to use a term that's 20 years old now, but it's all about multimedia, actually. And I maintain you can't think about text without setting it in the context of all the other things that we're using and doing. Because people still write, but they write in very different ways. They write using blogs, microblogs. I mean, I think I write using Twitter. Okay, I love Twitter and I love doing short microblogs with links in, with photos in, with videos in, and that's all interconnected or deeply intertwined. We write using speech, increasingly speech to text and text to speech in all the different languages. Be very important. Google's done so much on this. We write using photos and videos in a way that we couldn't possibly do 25 years ago. So I'm reminded, and I was reminded earlier, that this is 2017, and in fact it's September 2017, which is the 20th anniversary of the Hypertext 97 conference, which Mark famously was the programme chair for, but missed because he was ill. Several other of us in the room were here. It's where we first met Nick Gibbons. Dave was there, Les was there. Who else was here? Who's at Hypertext? I think Hugh was there. Luke was in the university but didn't attend. Oh,
I can't remember.
you can't remember because of the. As I remember, we did drink a lot, as I recall. That's what everyone. Rob Askin emailed me the other week. Said, "I'd love to come and see you next time in the UK. I still have fond memories of all the alcohol we drank in 1997 in Southampton." I could tell you lots of stories about the drinking team that we had then. But anyway, that was the conference where Ted, and it clashed. It was the same dates as the 6th World Wide Web Conference, which is run by one Bebo White, who I've now got to know in Santa Clara, the same week as our hypertext conference. And at the time, I was trying to get hypertext and the web closer together. I got them to change the name of SIGLink to SIGWeb, but that's about as far as I got. And that was the time when Ted famously addressed over a live video link that was run by Dave DeRaw, which was really difficult to do at the time, a live video link with Santa Clara, when Ted said, "Your future is my past," to the World Wide Web people at the other end. And of course his phrase, "I've lived by but everything's deeply intertwined." Tim didn't like separable links. He said to us, when we were doing microcosm, he did like microcosm. He thought it should have been a front end to the web, really, but of course Mosaic came along. But he always said to me, "Wendy, people will lose those links. We've got to embed them, but they will lose them." But if you remember, Dave, we had the most amazing visions of hypertext links in those days. You do. We used to think about, we'd think a link, right? We'd think a link. And that's what we were actually trying to do. We had that portfolio of projects with microcosm, where we were trying links in audio and in video and in photos. Of course, all that is even harder to preserve. You try and preserve social media with links in, right? Brewster Kahle has led the way, but this is, I think, absolutely, Nigel talked about it earlier, it's one of Vince's main topics, and I'm getting more and more involved in it. How we preserve this stuff when it's all so deeply intertwined. I was just thinking about things like Luke was talking about fake news. Do we preserve the fake news? And how do we tell the historians of the future that this is fake and that wasn't? You know, I mean, it's going to be much harder for them. This fake news, as Luke says, existed forever. But it's much, much harder, I think, to disassemble what is true and what isn't in the social media. And Luke's point about provenance is going to be increasingly important, that we store all that with the other data that we store and the text. But you see, I think what I loved about Frode's system, and I've got a minute, maybe less, always, is the fact that he picks up with Liquidizer the flow of linking that we envisaged in microcosm, the generic links, and applying a link to a potentially abstract concept, and being able to follow it, and to do that in the text. And I love that, but I think in the future it is going to be more than that. The future is about cognitive links, I think, picking up on the sort of things Paul was talking about, and again that goes back to Vannevar Bush, as we may think. So for me, the future of text is, I'm afraid, Ted was right, the future of text is hypermedia. Because I don't think linear text isn't how we communicate these days, it's a part of it. So it's hypermedia, or it might even be augment, or maybe it's social machines augmented by hypermedia. Thank you.
Since I recorded this special, because you're talking about Ted, who couldn't be here this time, maybe we could all have a round of applause for Ted, for his inspiration. We miss you, Ted.
We miss you, Ted. We miss you, Ted. We did try to get him to beam in live to this, but time differences and all that were hard. Henry?
Because you've been in the area so long, I came across an article that spoke about hyper data, I think, actually. And I wondered, where does the word hyper come from? Because
Ted.
But why did he use it? Right.
Something above.
Is that it?
It's not hyper as in.
No.
It's yes. It's I mean, his links were actually quite, I think, abstract. Although he always had problems with how to implement that. But that's what it meant. Above and across. So that was definitely a TED invention. He invented the words hypertext and hypermedia, and that, I think, hyperlink is a derivative of that was coined in more recent times.
Yeah, let's make it really clear that a link is not hypertext, okay? Ted has clarified later that what he means by hypertext is freedom for the God, the author, and freedom for the God of the reader.
But also non-sequential, because Ted's work is all about
post-it notes.
It's copying and pasting, because Ted is all about the copyright thing, which is one of the first talks today, all about who owns that information. That's why micropayments were there, that's why transclusions was there, and in his model, and I think blockchain is perfect for the original model that Ted had, if my understanding of blockchain is correct, because his model was very much anything that appears on Xanadu, which is partially implemented by the web. Anything, you have its provenance, you say who wrote it, where does it come from, and that is carried forward in that piece of information, whether it's a sentence or a paragraph or a whole book, whoever copies and pastes it, and that's how you track the micropayment issues, how you track who gets what bit of any publication that has that in. I think it's how you do citations. And I remember the first time I met Ted, I was with Andrew Fountain. Some of you will remember, because he was one of the key proponents of the early microcosms, and we were in Toronto, which is where Andrew ended up running a seminary. And he left hypertext to become leader of a religious sect. But
what's the difference?
We worship Ted. But the thing I remember asking him, because this was like, I think it was late 80s, early 90s. We were into microcosm anyway. It must have been early 90s. And I heard Ted speak there, I think, or maybe the second time I heard him speak, and we were asking him, how would you apply hypermedia links to video? And he said, it's easy. You just use what I've given you. Transclusions, micropayments, that covers everything. Forget the implementation in terms of the ideas. He was so right. Vint?
So I'm thinking that just to make the problem harder for the good of all mankind, you've got future of text now all this time, but it's really the future of digital objects in general, linking them together and imbuing them with properties that we can make use of. The context, for example, that helps us do something with these things. So I think if we're going to push this a little further, we're going to have to think in much more general terms. That these objects, whatever they are, text, video, or anything else, have properties that we can get access to, provenance being one of them, what sort of software is needed to exercise the object, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So at some point, I think our topic may have to broaden, in spite of, I'm sorry, I have to take this phone.
Yes, he does.
And then I can disagree with you.
I was just going to say, we leave the last word to Vint, because he is right. I mean, he's echoing what I said. And it's objects that include extract whole social machines, parts of social machines. We're making those objects harder and harder as we go forward. But this is how we're communicating.
You may think that I would disagree with you. In the military, there is a concept of force multiplier, right? So you need to do something bad to those guys over there. You have a gun or whatever it might be. But then you have other things that come into play to make that more effective, right? The reason I started the future of text is not because I think it's only text, forget everything. I'm educated as an artist. I used to be a photographer. So when it comes to multimedia, images and video and all of that, it's very important. The reason we have the future of text is only because it's getting very little attention. If you search for the sentence, the future of text, in Google, you will find this. That's scary as insert expletive here, right? That's really scary, that it isn't something that one of the big guys are doing, right? But of course, both Vint and Wendy, they're absolutely right. We need to have the force multipliers onto each medium, right? Text makes pictures more powerful and vice versa. So of course we need to
Absolutely.
work together. But I'm a bit worried about suddenly it's all pictures again.
Well, I think everything's deeply intertwined. Shall we finish with that?
Yes, we shall.
Thank you.
Um,
There's a pair of glasses up here.
did you manage to find Nicola?
The winner was.
Where is she?
Nicola's over there.
Come here. So we will be having drinks outside for an hour. And tomorrow we're starting at 10 for those of you who can make it. And you weren't all here this morning, so the day will be split in half. First, we define the issues in the morning, and goodness gracious, today was an amazing resource for that. Second half of the day is discussing how to have it. And I would like to thank Nicola, whom you may have seen a little bit out there, but she was the one who made today actually happen. So, yeah, drinks, everybody.